The morning had broken over the ridge like a whisper, and Harold had stirred from his creaking cot with the stiff ache of old bones and older memories, the kind that settled into a man when the silence became too familiar and the calendar too blank. The air smelled of pine and river rock, and the birds called in short, startled bursts that made the trees seem restless. He shuffled to the porch, coffee in hand, same as he had done for the past 11 years since the world had grown too loud and too fast for a man like him. And that was when he saw her moving across the clearing with a limp that spoke of pain and urgency, her fur streaked with mud and sap and blood. The bobcat was not large, but she held herself with a weight that made the morning pause around her, and in her jaws was a bundle no larger than a glove, hanging like a question between life and death. Harold did not move. Not at first, because this was not something the woods had ever shown him before in all his time out. Here the animals came and went in the rhythms of nature. But this was something else entirely, something that did not fit the pattern. The cat came closer, her breath ragged and chest heaving each step a struggle as if she had come farther than her body could handle, but she never took her eyes off Harold. And in those eyes, he saw not the wild, but the pleading of something desperate. Not human, but not fully animal either. It was a look that broke through the line between species and spoke in. The ancient language of need. She reached the edge of the porch and then dropped to her side, the kitten landing gently in the brittle grass like a broken bird, and Harold moved without thinking, setting his cup aside and stepping down into the morning. Missed to kneel beside her, he expected her to hiss or run or fight, but she only watched with heavy blinking eyes while her flank rose and fell in shallow waves. The kitten did not move, did not breathe or mewl, and Harold felt a pang deep in his chest. A tightness he had not known in years, not since the night his phone had rung with the voice that told him his daughter was gone. A collision on the interstate, rain and glass and sirens, and after that the world had narrowed down to trees and tools. And the slow patience of forgetting, he reached down and touched the kitten gently. Its fur was damp and too cold, and the breath he was searching for was too faint to be sure. But something told him it was not yet gone. Not entirely gone, and the mother bobcat closed her eyes as if she knew this too. Or maybe she was simply giving up her strength, spent in the journey. Whatever had driven her to this old cabin in the middle of nowhere must have been powerful, because animals do not come to men, they flee from them, and wild mothers never surrender their young unless there is no other path. And Harold was not a healer. He was a man of wood and weather, but something in his hands remembered how to be gentle. And he lifted the kitten slowly, cradling it in his palm, and turned toward the cabin with a sense that what was about to happen would not be explainable or logical or even believable. The bobcat made no move to stop him, only laid her head down on the grass and watched as he crossed. The threshold with her child, the fire inside was low but steady, casting flickers against the log walls, and Harold laid the kitten down on an old wool scarf by the hearth, wrapping it tight and setting a pot to boil on the stove. He remembered from somewhere that sugar water could help with shock, that warmth was more important than food at first, that the body had to believe it was safe before it would begin the work of healing. He whispered things as he moved, not words, just soft sounds meant to comfort, and maybe also to quiet the pounding in his own chest outside. He could hear nothing. No birds, no wind, just the soft breathing of a wild mother waiting, and the creak of the cabin walls as if they too were holding their breath. He dipped a rag into the warm water and wiped the blood from the kitten's face, saw that its eyes were closed but twitching faintly, and that its paw gave a tiny tremor like the flick of a dream, and he leaned closer, heart thudding because it was more than he had dared to hope. And yet the memory of stillness still haunted him, and he could not allow himself to believe just yet. He sat by the fire for hours, feeding drops of water through a bent spoon and humming low songs his grandmother had once sung to calm storms. And all the while the mother bobcat lay outside, silent, unmoving, her golden eyes glowing faintly through the dark like twin embers, watching, waiting, maybe judging, or maybe just hoping for a miracle. And the forest seemed to draw in around them, heavy with silence and time and questions that Harold did not know how to ask, let alone answer. Night came like a whisper, and the stars blinked on in the sky one by one, like signals from faraway places, and Harold sat by the kitten, unmoving, unwilling to leave its side. And as the firelight danced across the small furred body, he thought he saw the chest rise, then fall, then rise again, and he sat forward, breath caught in his throat. Because maybe, just maybe, this was not and maybe it was something else. Something older than death, and deeper than fear. And just then a sound came from outside, a shift in the underbrush, a snapping of a twig, deliberate, not animal, not wind. Something moving toward the cabin, slow and sure. And Harold stood slowly, his knees aching, the kitten still cradled in one arm, and he stepped to the window and pulled back the curtain. But what he saw in the trees made his blood run cold. Harold's breath fogged the glass in front of him. But, though he waited, his eyes could not adjust fully in that moment to see what lurked beyond the trees. Nothing moved yet. The forest felt alive, as though it were leaning in to watch him, to listen to his next breath. And that was enough to make him step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The kitten pressed close to his side, its fur damp but warmer now, and humming in its sleep, perhaps from some fragile surge of life. Harold dared not let his thoughts wander to what that sound might have been, whether predator or person, whether threat or a witness to the strange scene. He could not know what had propelled the mother bobcat to venture across rough ridges and deep streams. To bring this helpless creature to his cabin, he felt something in him stir that he had long thought dead, a sense of duty, or perhaps mercy, or sheer confusion. But no matter what it was, he could not turn away from what lay in his hands. He crossed the room slowly, the wooden floorboards groaning underfoot. The kettle hissed softly on the stove like a warning, and he paused to glance at the dim corridor that led to the back of the cabin. Beyond was tools and blankets and an old first aid kit. He reached for it, his fingers trembling as the world beyond. The walls sagged under the silence. He opened the kit and found antiseptic wipes, gauze, and a thin syringe, one meant for human emergency use, though he knew better than to trust human prescriptions for wild animals. But he had nothing else. He moistened a fine bit of cotton with clean water and touched it to the kitten's lips. The creature's eyes fluttered in its socket, and its body convulsed lightly, as though wrestling inside some darkness to find the will to live. Harold swallowed hard. The moments stretched thin between life and death, between the living and what might be beyond, and somewhere deep in his recollection, a memory surfaced of his daughter when she had been small and ill, and he had sat by her bedside in the hospital, holding her hand while the machines whispered their warnings. He had prayed then, though he had since let go of the habit, but perhaps tonight he prayed again, not in words, but in longing for whatever mercy the universe might allow. He dabbed the kitten's mouth with fresh water again, then held it to his chest, so its warmth might draw back the cold creeping in its limbs. The mother bobcat outside stirred, and Harold froze. Mid-movement, sounds of her breath, shallow but steady, came through the thin walls. He had left the door slightly ajar for air, but now he closed it inch by inch, not wanting to separate himself from the kitten, but fearing intrusion from whatever had dared approach the cabin. Slow footsteps or shifting shadows unknown. But he had to protect this moment, this fragile turning point in memory or miracle. He returned to the hearth, drew up the wool scarf carefully around the kitten's body. Leaving its head free, he whispered songs his grandmother had sung long ago, lullabies, from a time when the world seemed kinder than now. And though the words had no shape, his voice trembled and reached into the edges of darkness, as though beseeching it to wait and hold its hand. He sat closer to the fire, warming his bones, and the kittens, though neither of them could be sure who was sustaining whom. The night pressed down on the cabin walls, heavy and dense with unseen life beyond the logs. The wind moaned in the rafters, and Harold thought he heard a whisper that might have been a name, perhaps his daughter's name, or perhaps just a trick of his grief. But it snapped his mind away from speculation and back to the tiny life before him. The kitten stirred more insistently, its paw pushing faintly against his shirt. His breath caught in his throat because the movement suggested that inside that tiny chest, something beyond shock remained a spark. And if that spark survived the night, then everything might change. Harold exhaled slowly, and in that exhale he felt his circuits reconnect, his patience, return his resolve steel over fear. and he resolved to keep watch through the night. At dawn, he would venture out to scan the perimeter, the forest lines, the trails for what had moved so close and why. But until then, he would tend the kitten whatever it needed, whatever cost. And as he thought this, the mother bobcat's eyes shone beyond the window pane, and something in them shifted. As though she saw him differently now, perhaps as keeper, or witness, or companion. But whatever she saw, her gaze did not waver. It held him in place as he turned away to check the kitten's breathing again, its chest moving in shallow arcs. Faint, but certain enough to give him reason to hope, yet not enough to rest. He reclined in a chair by the hearth and cradled the small creature in his lap, rocking gently as one might a child yet wary of the danger in the dark. The minutes crept forward, the silence of the cabin punctuated by the crackle of fire. The wind outside rose then died. The roof boards sighed, and the shadows behind every corner seemed to pulse with possibility. Harold forced his eyes open, though exhaustion pressed on him, like a blind weight. Yet he could not drift fully into sleep, for fear something would slip past him and claim the moment the kitten twitched again, and he sat up fast. His pulses jarring the lamp beside him, swinging its wick. The light flickered, casting long shapes against the wall, and he heard a barely audible sound from the direction of the back door, like cloth brushing wood or soft leather sliding across stone, and his heart froze. He dared not breathe, lest he disturb the balance. The mother bobcat raised her head and stared into the darkness between trees and the cabin walls, as though sensing something beyond. Harold held the kitten tighter and edged toward the wall to peer through a narrow slit beside the window, but the glass was too smeared with his breath to see clearly. He reached a hand up to brush aside an old curtain. Then his eyes widened at a figure standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in shadow. A tall shape, motionless, and still in contrast to the trembling leaves around it. He could not tell whether human or wild. It stood too still, too poised, and the forest around it seemed to recoil from its presence. A chill crawled along Harold's spine. The kitten squirmed in his arms, its small body stirring, as if attuned to danger, and he felt the metallic taste of fear on his tongue. He swallowed it down, remembering the vow he made to this creature, born not of his kind, but entrusted to him by a wild mother. And he whispered under his breath more songs, more prayers, more gentle sound to calm both his fear and the kitten's trembling. His hand went to the old rifle he kept behind the stove, used long ago for deer and nuisance animals. He had not fired it in years. But in that moment, he unclasped the barrel and braced it across his knee, ready, though he hated violence. But he would protect this life no matter what the cost. He sank to one knee, shifting. So he faced both window and door. The figure outside had not moved, nor turned away, and Harold felt the cabin narrow around him, like a trap that had closed tight centuries ago, in the days when men whispered of spirits and wanderers, and small acts of mercy turned worlds upside down. He waited silent, ignorant of time, as the kitten whimpered faintly in his lap, hunger, or fear he could not know, but fear whispered that it might not survive if left unprotected. Another minute, another breath, another moment could be its last. But the figure outside remained still. Then a distant bark echoed through the trees, perhaps the cry of a wild wolf or coyote, or perhaps a warning that the forest had awakened, and as the echo died, Harold sensed movement behind the figure in the trees. Two more shapes emerging from the dark. They did not approach directly. Instead, they circled the cabin at a distance, their pace slow, patient, stalking perhaps, or perhaps testing the barrier between them and him. And inside the cabin, the mother bobcat rose painfully to her paws, though she looked wounded still. She limped into the room through the open door, her eyes narrowing on the stranger shapes beyond the windows. She placed herself between Harold and the threat chest. Low hackles raised. The menace in the room grew heavy, and Harold's finger tightened on the trigger of the rifle, though he would rather not fire. But he would if he must. He moved the kitten to the ground, slowly cradled in the wool scarf so as not to break its rest, but prepared to defend it if the danger came closer. He held the rifle tight and stood by the hearth beside the mother bobcat, and they formed a line of guardianship splintered by species, but united in purpose, and the firelight danced across their faces, giving them a fierce cast as though the two had merged in that moment into a single force. The creatures outside paused, The shapes halted their circular path, and shadow and wind stilled, as though the forest itself awaited the next move. Harold's heart thundered in his chest. He swallowed dry saliva and lifted the rifle barrel a breath past, and neither side moved. The kitten nestled on the scarf, its chest rising faintly in shallow arcs, and Harold remembered how things had shifted in his life, how loss had clawed at him like claws at bark, and how solitude had hardened him. But now he felt something fragile swelling in his chest, a strange, fierce love for this small life, for this wild mother that trusted him, and for whatever unknown world lurked beyond the logs. And in that breath, the forest exhaled, and a single twig snapped just beyond the window. The figures outside convulsed as though startled, and two of them jumped back behind trees. Then one remained motionless, heart of darkness in the clearing, and Harold's finger trembled on the trigger. The mother bobcat snarled low and lunged forward. The fireplace logs cracked, sending sparks upward. The kitten let out a tiny protest of surprise, and Harold froze, his eyes locked on the figure through the glass. It was tall, lean, long limbs like branches, but human enough to be disturbing enough to unsettle the balance of wild and domestic. He stared back, and Harold felt the air between them pull taut like a whispered promise or threat. Then the figure faded, backward into the darkness, retreating like an animal disturbed by light, and Harold exhaled, though he felt too numb to feel relief. The shapes in the distance slipped away among the trees, and the forest swallowed them up once more, leaving silence, heavy and pressing, and Harold sank beside the kitten, gathering it to his chest again. Tears blurred his eyes, but he would not let them fall. Not yet. He rose and turned to the mother bobcat. She stood guard by the window, her eyes unblinking. And though she limped, she seemed resolute and regal, and Harold placed a hand gently on her shoulder, hair warm under his palm, and she met his gaze as though acknowledging a pact between them, a fragile bridge between wild mother and human guardian for now. The danger had backed away, but Harold knew it would come again. He settled by the fire lamp, dim now, letting the shadows reclaim corners of the room, and he wrapped the kitten again in the scarf, pressing it close as it whimpered softly, its eyes flickering open though unfocused, and Harold whispered through the darkness, "Do not fear, we will endure." And in that whisper, he meant it with every remnant of strength he possessed. And outside in the forest, the wind sighed and the trees bowed, and perhaps they listened, for in the distance a wolf howled and the echo rolled over the hills, and Harold leaned back against the wall holding life in his arms, while the mother bobcat remained sentry by the door, and the silence stretched between what was known and what lurked beyond, and nothing moved but everything watched. And Harold realized that the night was far deeper than he had ever imagined, and he would have to be deeper still. The fire had burned low, and the room had grown cold. Despite the layers of blankets wrapped around the sleeping kitten, Harold sat motionless, watching the flames as they flickered and danced, casting long shadows across the log walls. The mother bobcat still stood near the door, her eyes fixed on the window as if the darkness outside had not yet surrendered whatever presence had come and gone. In the night, the air was thick with something he could not name, a kind of waiting that felt heavy in his chest. And as the kitten stirred again, letting out a low, rasping sound, Harold leaned forward with a sudden surge of alertness. The sound was small, but it was there, a voice trying to return to the world. And he whispered gently, a sound without shape or meaning, just to reassure the tiny life before him, and the mother bobcat turned her head slightly, as if she too had heard the change and was waiting for more. Harold reached for the kettle and poured lukewarm water into a cup, dipping a piece of cloth in it, and then carefully holding it to the kitten's mouth. He had not expected it to respond so soon. But as the damp cloth touched its lips, the kitten's mouth moved and a faint flicker of a tongue appeared, and for a moment, Harold forgot the fear. The forest, the figures outside, everything vanished, except this moment of undeniable fragile progress. The mother bobcat moved closer, one step at a time, her limp pronounced now, her sides heaving, and her breathing labored, but her gaze sharp and focused. She came to rest beside the hearth, her front paws barely brushing the edge of the wool scarf that still cradled her child, and Harold sat back, letting her presence bring comfort, if not warmth, to the space between them. Outside, the trees whispered again, the kind of wind that moves not with the air, but with something older, a voice of branches brushing against one another. Like secrets passed through generations, Harold rose and added a fresh log to the fire. The crackle loud in the silence, and he looked toward the window, unsure if he would see movement again, or if the night had taken its secrets and fled with the sunrise. The sky outside was no longer black, but a pale gray as dawn approached without fanfare, and Harold stepped to the porch with careful measured steps. Holding the rifle loosely at his side, he scanned the clearing. The frost still clung to the grass, but the footprints were gone. No trace of the figures remained, only the Bobcat's prints and his own, and a strange, circular impression near the far tree line that made no sense to him, too. Even too deliberate, he crouched beside it, touching the dirt with his fingertips. But it was already beginning to fade beneath the warming air. He returned inside and closed the door behind him gently, as if not to wake the walls, and returned to the fire. The kitten was stirring more now, its paws flexing its head, lifting slightly, though its eyes remained closed and its breathing was shallow. Harold reached down and felt the heat from its belly, the spark of life burning hotter now, and he smiled. Not because it was over, but because it had begun. And the mother bobcat watched him with eyes that still held wilderness, but something else too, maybe trust, or maybe recognition of something ancient shared between them. He remembered stories his grandmother used to tell when he was a boy, about animals bringing omens or choosing guardians, about how the forest had its own laws, and sometimes broke them for reasons men could not understand. He had never believed them, not really, until now, until a mother brought her dying child to a stranger's cabin and waited for something more than fate. Harold stood and moved toward the shelf on the far wall, pulling down an old book that had belonged to his daughter, filled with drawings of animals and forests and stars. He opened it slowly, each page a memory, each sketch a ghost, and he paused on one of a wildcat curled beside a stream, her eyes closed and a single cub pressed to her belly, drawn in soft pencil lines that seemed to breathe. He knelt beside the kitten again and held the book open where the mother could see it. Not sure why he did it, but feeling that it mattered, and the bobcat looked at the image, and then at her own child, and then at Harold. And in that moment, something passed between them like a thread, woven in silence. Not magic, not myth, just understanding. He set the book down beside the hearth and reached for the last of the powdered milk he had kept stored for emergencies. He mixed it carefully, stirring until it was warm, and then used a cloth wrapped around his finger to feed the kitten slowly. Patiently, each drop accepted like a tiny victory, and the kitten responded, lips moving, body shivering slightly, but the swallowing real and deliberate. And Harold exhaled again deeply, as if breathing for the first time in days. Outside, the first light of morning filtered through the trees, casting pale gold beams across the floor, and for the first time, Harold could see clearly the wear on the bobcat's body, the deep cuts along her flank, the swelling in one leg, the patch of fur missing from her shoulder. He reached toward her slowly, his hand open and flat, and though she flinched at first, she did not retreat. He touched her side gently, and she growled low, but did not strike. And he whispered, "I see you, and I will help if you let me." The cabin had changed now, no longer just a retreat for one old man, but a sanctuary for something larger, something unspoken. And Harold felt both overwhelmed and needed in a way he had not felt in years, as if the forest had chosen to remember him when the world had forgotten, and he would not waste that chance. The fire blazed, brighter now, as if reflecting the pulse of life growing in the kitten, and Harold turned to tend the logs when he heard it again. A sound from the trees, not footsteps, not wind, but a low groan like wood under pressure or stones shifting beneath. Earth, and he froze, hand halfway to the poker. He glanced at the door, then the window, and the bobcat lifted her head. Ears perked, hackles, raised, her gaze locked on the same direction as before, as if whatever had come had returned, but this time it brought something different. Not menace, perhaps, but intention. Harold set the poker down slowly and reached for the rifle again, the weight of it familiar, but not welcome. And he stood by the window watching as the edge of the forest shifted slightly, a branch moving with no wind, A shadow pulling back from the light. He did not know if it would come closer or vanish like smoke as it had before. But he knew this was not over, and the miracle he had witnessed might come at a price. The kitten stirred, again stronger this time, a small cry from its throat, almost like a meow, but hoarse and unfinished, and Harold looked down at it and knew that everything had changed. The bobcat stepped closer to her child, her body pressed low, her tail twitching, and she watched the forest with ancient fury, and Harold stood beside her, feeling the line between them disappear, and somewhere beyond the trees, something watched and waited still, not ready to show itself, and the dawn crept slowly over the hills, holding its breath for what would come next. The sky had turned pale blue with streaks of gold as the sun began to rise above the treetops, casting long fingers of light across the clearing and through the cracks in the cabin walls. But the warmth it brought did not ease the tension that gripped Harold's chest, nor did it soften the eyes of the mother bobcat who stood alert and unmoving beside her kitten, whose tiny breath now came steadier but still faint and uncertain. Harold had spent the hours in silence, watching, waiting, listening to the forest speak in ways most people had long forgotten, the language of leaves shifting, of birds gone quiet, of branches swaying to something that was not wind. He had lived among these trees long, enough to know when something was wrong, when the natural order had bent or snapped, and this morning it felt like something ancient had stirred and was not ready to settle back into its slumber. The rifle still rested near the hearth untouched since the hours before, but Harold could feel its weight in the room. Like an unspoken word too loud to ignore, the fire had dimmed, but its glow still flickered across the cabin walls, casting shapes that looked like stories from another time. And Harold glanced down at the kitten, now curled tightly against the wool scarf, its eyes still shut, but its body no longer limp and lifeless, and a strange hope crept into his heart. Despite the heaviness that lingered outside, he stepped to the door, slowly, and eased it open. The hinges groaned low and metallic like a warning, and he stepped onto the porch, the cold air brushing his face like breath from the mountain, and the forest stood still, too still. The usual sounds of squirrels chattering, birds calling, even the distant cry of hawks were gone, replaced by the strange hush that had settled in since the night before, and Harold scanned the trees, the edge of the clearing, the place where the strange figure had stood, and where the other shadows had circled like wolves in the dark, but there was no sign of movement, only the soft rustle of leaves that should not have moved, and the sense that he was being watched from far too many directions. At once he turned back into the cabin, and found the mother bobcat pacing now, her limp more pronounced, but her body tense muscles coiled her gaze, darting from window to door to the sleeping kitten, as if she too felt what Harold could not see but knew was close. And he whispered low, to her, not to soothe, but to share something unspoken. I do not know what it is, but I will not let it take her. And as he spoke, the kitten stirred its head, lifting slightly, its eyes flickering open, thin slivers of cloudy blue that blinked once, then again, and Harold knelt beside it, unable to stop the tremble in his hands as he reached out gently, his fingers brushing its fur, and he felt a warmth there, a pulse of life that had not been there before. And it looked at him, not fully aware, but not afraid, and he whispered, "Welcome back, little one. You're not alone." And the mother bobcat lowered her head beside him, eyes locked on her child, and a sound came from deep in her throat, not a growl, not a cry, something softer and older, and Harold realized he had not heard anything like it before, but it felt like a song, like grief, like gratitude, and maybe both at once, and for a brief moment, he thought the worst had passed. But then came the knock, 3 soft taps against the wooden door, not loud, not urgent, but deliberate, and Harold stood so fast the chair behind him tipped and hit the floor with a dull thud. He moved to the door, rifle in hand, though his arms felt heavy and the weight of the moment pressed against his spine. He did not open the door. Not yet. He placed his hand flat against it and listened. There was no voice, no sound beyond it, no footsteps walking away, no breath on the other side, only the 3 knocks still echoing in his head like a question with no words, and he called out, "Who's there?" His voice sharp against the silence. And still no answer. Only that crushing quiet, the kind that pulls everything inward. And he looked through the crack in the window, but saw no one. Nothing but the edge of the clearing and the trees swaying in a rhythm that didn't match the wind. He turned back to the bobcat now crouched protectively over the kitten, whose eyes remained open but still unfocused. And Harold knew in that moment that whatever had come, knocking was not something that could be reasoned with or turned away. It was not a hunter or a lost hiker or a curious ranger. It was something older, something tied to the forest and the story that had begun when a mother brought her dying child to a man who had lost his own, and the fire snapped behind him, casting sparks into the air, and the door creaked again, though no one touched it. And Harold backed away slowly, drawing the rifle to his shoulder. And the mother bobcat let out a low growl that built into a rumble that shook the floorboards, and then from the woods came the sound of something approaching. Not footsteps exactly, but a kind of crawling, dragging, slithering presence that seemed to ripple through the trees like shadow. Made solid, and the door rattled once more, then went still, and the light in the cabin flickered, as if something had passed over the roof, blocking the sun for just a breath of time, and then it was gone.